From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So my name is Terry Sierra. I'm the chief of the Serial and Government Publications Division here at the Library of Congress, which happens to be the home of our comic book collection. Our comic book collection is probably one of the largest in the world. At this point, we have, Georgia, jump in if I am not right on the number, more than 135,000 single issues. Yeah, it is a big wow number. So we acquire and we maintain, we preserve, and we serve our collection of comic books to researchers from all over the world. And by library standards, this is a gold level collection. It's very important to us. So SPX is a subset. SPX meaning Small Press Expo. Collection is a subset of our comic book collection, and it came about through an agreement that the library signed with the Small Press Expo in 2011 that allows us to collect a set amount of issues from the small press on the weekend, which is this weekend of small press, including the Ignatz winners, all the winners and nominees we collect. I personally think of this lecture, not part of the agreement, but it's become a tradition that on the SPX weekend, we start with a lecture, and I believe that we kick off the weekend. So today's lecture celebrates the success of these three gentlemen, Josh O'Neill, Andrew Karl, and Chris Stevens, publishing through their own Locust Moon Press, the Eisner Award winner, Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream. I love that name, that title. Isn't it great? Dream Another Dream. Anyway, it is based, for those of you who may or may not know, in Nemo in Slumberland, the comic strip created by the very talented Winsor McCay. I think it's fair to say that he transformed the comic strip, comic book art world for his use of form, color, panels, timing, size, and so many other things. McKay's style has influenced the comic strip artists since, numerous comic strip artists. And as you see, if you see, do we have some of the old from the New York Herald? No?
Well, we've got the best
Okay, the best of.
We'll be seeing some in the
Oh, we have
presentation
slides.
too.
Okay,
Yeah.
awesome. It's beautiful stuff. It really, really is. It was published originally in the New York Herald in 1905 and ran there until 1911. 1911, it went to the New York American under the name of Land of Wonderful Dreams, another great title. It ran there until 1924 and finally ceased publication in 1926. So today, I can't wait to hear from our speakers about how they came about the idea, and interestingly, how they use Kickstart to fund. So please welcome Josh and Chris, known in Philadelphia as the mayors of Comicsville, and from San Francisco, comic writer on his own right, and the editor-in-chief of Locust Moon Press. Welcome, gentlemen.
Well, thank you very much. My name's Chris Stevens. It's good to see everyone here. Thanks for coming out. This is my partner, Andrew Karl, Josh O'Neill, and we are invited to speak to you here today on the eve of SPX about our book, Little Nemo, Dream Another Dream. We gathered 140 of our favorite creators. Book's coming in right on time. Beautiful. Thank you, Esther.
Thanks, Esther.
And we gathered 140 of our favorite contemporary creators to pay tribute to Winsor McCay, who was a great American cartoonist and innovator in several media, which we'll get into shortly. There's Winsor, dapper fellow, as you can see. He was born in, it says 1870. One of the peculiar facts of McKay's life is no one really knows when he was born. It's sort of lost to time. It was sometime 1865 to 1870. He was born in Michigan, a very hard scrabble, sort of homesteader life, rural lifestyle. But from a young age, he displayed, classic prodigies, abilities in art as a drawer, artist. And by the time he was a teenager, he left home for what must have been to him sort of bustling metropolis beckoning of Cincinnati. He arrives in Cincinnati, and McKay works at various department stores creating window signage. He creates circus posters for the fledgling P.T. Barnum wannabes of the day. Don't think he ever worked for Barnum in particularly. Would have been an interesting connection. But McKay, more than anything, McKay drew. He drew editorial illustrations. He created numerous strips besides Nemo, which we're going to speak about today. He created the Dreams of the Rare Bit Fiend, which is endured, Sammy Sneeze, many things, including some famous and revolutionary work in animation. And here you can see his most famous and probably his personally most beloved creation when it comes to his work in animation, Gertie the Dinosaur. McKay drew the way a horse runs, we like to say. And he, in 1 month, produced over 4,000 single illustrations to give you a second or two of the type of animation you see here. So, besides for his achievements as a comic strip artist and one of the founders of the medium, he was important, the work he did in animation as well. But the main work, the work that turns us on the most, the work that our book is based on, and the reason we're here today, is Little Nemo in Slumberland, which started in 1905, as Terry said, and ran until 1911 in its original incarnation in the New York Herald. That's the most fondly remembered. Afterwards, the work was good. He was probably a little more handcuffed by the powers that be. His life was probably a little more complex, and maybe there wasn't some of the, he didn't quite have the pure wonder that the original 5-6 year run had. I think all the pages we're shown today are from the 5 years, from the first 5 years. And for those of you not familiar with Little Nemo, these are 2 pages that are, pretty good examples. Basically, every page, a little boy would fall asleep at the beginning of the strip, enter into fantastical adventures in various dream worlds, and by the end would always wake up in the final panel, safe at home, mom and dad, back in the real world. It's for us all here gathered, I imagine we're all interested, in comic book art at some level, and probably take a lot of the things for granted that McKay didn't have the luxury of taking for granted in either making the work or trying to figure out how his audience would absorb the work, even read the work. If you see here, McKay had to sort of resort to numbering the panels in a way not to just rely on his ability, as great as he was, to lead your eye, but to instruct the reader, this is how you read a comic book page. Something probably we all would take for granted, and 100 years later seems like, oh wow, they had to do that. But one of the things that, as revolutionary as he was, as innovative as he was, he still had to be functional. And that's an interesting little fact of the form of function there. For me, one of the things I wanted to talk about when I realized we were going to be doing this talk today is with McKay, and you can see it in the pages here, what was he drawing on? There wasn't television, you weren't bombarded 24 hours a day with imagery from, everywhere you go, where did he get the sense of wonder? What was he pulling from? And there's a couple clear examples that we'll get into as we move forward here. The first being one that's really obvious once you get into it, and that would be the World's Fair of 1893, the famous Chicago World's Fair, the famous White City. We were talking about this a lot last night as we tried to prepare for this, and something we all stumbled upon at the same time was it's interesting to think, however much you know about the White City, I'm no expert, but it was built at a time when artifice, constructing, vast buildings and plots of land that were never truly meant to be occupied. You see here a beautiful, cityscape, but you can't go to the top of that tower. The steps don't function. It's all a facade in the way that we would think of cheap, boardwalk amusements of today. But back then, it was really, we were trying to show the world that America was special, that we were as good as Paris or any of the the world powers of the time. And the White City was definitely a sign of American opulence and optimism. And it's pretty easy to think of McKay having, these would have been widely replicated images. If you look to the postcard here on the right, that's something that, without too much of your imagination, McKay himself could have drawn, and it could be a backdrop for any one of the Little Nemo strips themselves. So for me, it's interesting to think of a man back then without, like I said, without the repetition of imagery that we're so used to through the internet. They had magazines, but it wouldn't be anything like today. He would have carried this stuff around with him. He would have been in his 20s when he would have first come across these images, and he would have carried them around for years until finally, inside a man with such a vivid imagination, the things that it would have stirred inside him could finally find their truest expression almost a dozen years later in the Little Nemo strips that began in 1905. So I think that's interesting to carry that around with you long enough where it comes out in such a sort of profound and large way that we're talking about it 100 years later. That's something he would have carried around with him, would have been an influence for years and years. When he left Cincinnati, which I mentioned earlier, he eventually built a reputation as one of the top newspaper editorial comic book artists, and was hired away by the New York Herald and went to New York, where the life that we think of, if you're into Winsor McCay, you think of him as this urbane, dignified sort of celebrity, modern American celebrity at the dawn of the 20th century. But he got to there with these dreams in his head, and when he did get there, it was a nice, fortuitous coming together of man and time, where instead of carrying around dreams in his head, he could sit on Coney Island, a place he frequented often, and see these sites that literally could have been drawn. If you guys are familiar with the Nemo strips, any of these images could have came straight out of any Nemo strip of almost any time. And I think it's interesting to think of a man like McKay with this vivid inner life, without the stimulus that we're all so used to, just sitting there taking this in. And he was in life, he was sort of a notorious teetotaler. He would order one drink and sit with his socialite friends, and it would sort of be a joke to see would Winsor ever finish his drink, and he never really did. But if you see these images, it's easy for me to project him being drunk off the scenes, the images, the experiences that were all around him on any given Coney Island evening. So I think the White City and Coney Island were really strong images you can reach out to and say, or influences you can say, these things were key in how did he construct such a vivid fantasy on the page. And an example of which that I wanted to talk about here today is a fairly iconic sequence from the first couple years in Nemo, the Ice Palace sequence. It runs 7 pages. He had done sustained narrative stuff before the Ice Palace. He certainly did longer pieces after the Ice Palace. They are, if you look at them here, if you're familiar with other Nemo pages, they're not the most technically dazzling pages that he did. We could show you other pages that would show off composition and just like tour de force drawing ability, maybe a little bit more than these. But with these, I've always thought that the simplicity of the setting allowed it to establish itself as a place that is eternal. I think we all have, whatever your background is, most people have, from childhood at least, stamped inside them some sort of fantasy of a winter wonderland, whether it's Christmas or whatever the mythological, this is Jack Frost's palace, and that's Jack Frost you see sitting in the bottom right, whether it's that sort of, iconography of religion or just a kid getting a school day off and going out and having a snowball fight, as we saw, previous pages, they're throwing snowballs around. We can all relate to that. And I think the simplicity of these pages sort of allowed them to become, at least for me, and probably, I imagine, many others, a portal to visit those feelings, those times, the idea of this eternal winter wonderland at any time through the pages here that McKay provided. But like all fantasies, and I promise you, like this talk itself, everything does come to an end. And you can see here, after some fun stuff on the other side, the fantasy coming to an end, much exactly like the White City itself, where this beautiful thing has been built, and it wasn't built to last. The White City was built in 3 months, taken down in a year. This strip lasted 7 pages, and at the very end, the High Price Ice Company comes in and literally disassembles Jack Frost's palace brick by brick, snowball by snowball. So it's sort of a bittersweet ending for all the fantasy and beauty of McKay's work. Like pretty much any great artist or communicator, it was tempered by the reality of the world he lived in, the things that we all go through, and this strip is sort of poignant in that for all the fantasy, it does come to an end. And as does my part of this talk, I'm going to turn you over to my partner, Josh O'Neill. Him and Andrew are going to get a little bit more into our book and some of the techniques and things that the artists involved in that got into, but I'll let Josh take the floor. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk about a lot of different things, but the one thing I want to mention about these pages is I love the ending of this Ice Palace sequence because it's the basic Little Nemo format sort of writ large. It's this crazy, wild adventure with all these beautiful edifices, this glorious world, and then in the end, it's just this totally mundane suburban world that kind of intrudes on it and interrupts it. I think it's pretty cool. And these pages and a lot of the other stuff that Chris showed, to me, demonstrates that Winsor McCay was and remains one of the greatest American artists, and Little Nemo is one of the truly singular bodies of work in American art. So we decided to bastardize it in the most Baroque and grandiose way we possibly could. For our anthology, we recruited 140 of the greatest cartoonists and illustrators in the world, people who loved McKay, people who had studied his work, people who had been inspired by it, and we tasked them with creating brand new Little Nemo strips in this giant-size art book, replicating the space of that glorious broadsheet page that he was using. We asked that they retain the basic structure of Little Nemo, which is that each strip is a dream, and in the end, there's a return to reality where the dreamer awakes. One of the things that was most exciting to us about this book was seeing how this love of McKay and this inspiration cuts across all these different boundaries in the comic book industry, from superheroes to independent comics, from industry legends to self-published zine makers, and everything in between. Because McKay was an artist who was standing at the dawn of this brand new comics medium and declaring that you could do anything on a comics page. And the cartoonists in this book are people who have spent their careers taking up that challenge and treating this medium as the incredibly potent and rich art form that it is. And that combination of inspiration and the intimidation of trying to live up to this incredible work, I think brought out the best in a lot of people. So we were also inspired not just by McKay and Nemo, but by these specific Little Nemo editions by a company called Sunday Press. They started coming out 10 years ago. And there have been many Little Nemo reprint editions over the years, but these are the first ones that reprint the strips at their original 16 by 21 size. For our tastes, as far as books, as art objects go, this is about as good as it gets. These are some of the most beautiful publications we've ever seen. The strips are so lovingly restored. We can't imagine a book that does what these books do any better in terms of honoring Nemo. So we used the vast resources of creativity and publishing acumen at our disposal to copy them exactly. We were lucky enough, Peter Maresca, who's the publisher of Sunday Press, worked with us and helped us figure out a lot of the design and production questions about the book and helped us create this edition that we hope can sit as a companion to his. What Peter did in publishing these books was a real service to art history and to comic lovers and readers everywhere, because seeing Little Nemo at a reduced size is like watching Lawrence of Arabia on your phone. You can enjoy it, you can appreciate it, you can see that it's something great, but you can't absorb the true majesty of what it's trying to do. Because this 16 by 21 page was this huge canvas that McKay was exploring and exploiting every week, every Sunday. He seized it like a piece of vital territory in the visual world. And it's a very rare thing for cartoonists these days to be able to work at this size with print suffering and with newspaper comics shrinking and dying. It's a very rare opportunity. So I think people to have not only the opportunity to work at this scale, but with this outsized inspiration was a really amazing and irresistible challenge for a lot of people. This is Mark Hempel's page. As you can see, he worked to the exact size of the book, as a lot of the cartoonists did. And it really allowed them to look at their strip not just as a piece of content to be reproduced at a certain size, but a physical piece of art that could be approached as an object that the reader would have to reckon and interact with. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the strips in particular, how some of McKay's own inspirations that Chris talked about get filtered down into some of these artists. This is Peter Bagg's strip from the book. He took on McKay's classic circus mirror trope, in which characters are distorted and stretched across the page. I've always loved how these circus strips, they make use of this giant space. They force you to deal with it as one giant page. They almost they reject your attempts to read it sequentially. You have to look at the whole thing at once. And it was this amazing way that McKay really took control of your eyes and really commanded the way you saw as a reader and a viewer of his artwork. Peter Bagg's artwork, he's one of my favorite cartoonists. He's known for these comics called Hate that are they're very intimate and personal comics about this guy named Buddy and his pals. And he is about as far from McKay in terms of the scale and scope of what he's trying to do. He's telling these very, very personal stories. But I loved seeing, he's using his hate characters in this strip, but he's bringing McKay's influence into it to create something a little more illustrative and bold and dreamlike. It's almost like the circus mirror of McKay's influence is distorting Peter's work. This is almost the opposite approach. If that was Peter bringing McKay into his own style, this is an artist named J.G. Jones, who's very well known for his beautiful painted superhero covers and many different well-known mainstream comics. He has a very identifiable and idiosyncratic style. But for this strip, he really taught himself to draw almost exactly like McKay. With help from these gorgeous colors from Jose Villarrubia that really replicated the Nemo colors. He's riffing on this classic setting, the steps in front of the Palace of Slumberland where a lot of Nemo strips were set. And it's an amazing thing to be able to draw like McKay, and in doing so, I think he created one of the most beautiful and visionary strips in the book. So Little Nemo, in its essence, was a very joyous, adventurous, sometimes silly strip. But it also dealt with a lot of heavier themes about aging and loss and death and frailty and failure. This, for my money, is maybe the saddest Little Nemo strip. It's one of his New Year's Day strips. His New Year's Day strips were often very sad, which is an idea that I like. He's always ringing in the new year with kind of a downer. But so in this strip on the left, Father Time, who always appears in the New Year's Day strips, he takes Nemo on a tour of the office where they keep all the years. And so he's taking down these different years, and you can see the numbers he's handing him. And when Nemo touches the year, he becomes the age that he will be on that year. And by the end, when he reaches the impossibly distant year of 1999, he becomes an old man, and you see him in that second to last panel, alone in the darkness on a snowy night, just begging to be made into a young boy again. Happy New Year. On the right is J.H. Williams' strip, who is kind of riffing off this idea. McKay always, I think as Chris mentioned, he numbered his panels, which was kind of an aid to readers to help them understand. Since comics were such a brand new medium at the time, it was sort of a way to hold people's hands through how to read a comic strip. But in Williams' strip, he's using that technique, but instead of panel numbers, he's using the age of Nemo, and he's trying to compress Nemo's whole life into one page. And, just like in the strip on the left, by the end, he's a sad old man and then awakes as a little boy again. To me, this strip is so beautiful. It's so full of life. It's literally full of a person's life. And J.H. Williams is very well known for his formal innovations, his incredibly complex and beautiful compositions. And I thought it was cool that for this project, rather than amp that up, like might have been a lot of people's impulse, he decided to do something very human scale and just see how much of a person's life he could condense onto one piece of paper. This is Katey Moody's strip. She took a really interesting kind of conceptual approach to this piece. She actually traced this little Nemo strip on the left and used changes to the text and different coloring techniques to kind of tell a story about how this famous Nemo strip of Nemo sliding down this endless banister got sort of transmitted through time, and how she first encountered it as a child in a Raggedy Ann cartoon. And so she's sort of tracing back how McKay's influence filtered down to her, and how she eventually found her way back to McKay. And she's sort of using this existing strip almost as a telephone to talk directly to the reader. I thought that was very interesting. This is Cole Klosters' strip. It's a very mournful and nostalgic and touching take on a sort of forgotten, decaying slumberland. That character walking around there is Flip. He's Little Nemo's sometimes his best friend, sometimes his nemesis, but he's probably the secondary character of Slumberland. And he's walking around this skeleton, which is the skeleton of Bosco the dragon, who was this dragon who had a throne inside of his mouth, and Flip and the princess and Nemo would ride around inside. So in Klosters' strip, Flip is walking around, and this dragon reminds him of something, but he can't really remember what. He's trying to think back. He remembers that there were some kind of adventures in the old days, but he can't really remember what happened. He thinks there was a boy. He can't remember his name. He thinks his name might have been No One, which is what Nemo means in Latin. And then up in the right-hand upper corner there is a drawing of McKay's house in Sheepshead Bay, where he lived for many years, that he would often draw into his own little Nemo strips. One of the most difficult aspects of this project was dealing with the character of the Jungle Imp, a cartoonish racial African savage caricature who spouts gibberish whenever he speaks. McKay was a man of his time, and though he was very politically progressive in many ways, his work betrayed some unenlightened views about race and gender. The last thing that we wanted to do was gloss over the more problematic aspects of Little Nemo, and it would have felt dishonest to whitewash a character who, for better or for worse, was very central to the Slumberland cast. So our best solution was just to address it head-on, let each artist make of the imp what they would. Farrell Dalrymple, for instance, in his strip had the imp speaking perfect English. And when Nemo says, how is it that I can understand you? The imp says, maybe you used to be more racist in your dreams. Cliff Chang addresses the imp in his sort of dehumanizing mask in a very interesting way that we'll look at a little bit later. But the artist who approached it most head-on was Ronald Wimberly, who makes the imp the hero of his strip and gives him a kind of heroism and nobility that he never got from McKay. The strip simultaneously pays admiring tribute to McKay's ambition and design sensibility while calling out something that needs to be called out and addressed. James Harvey is a very interesting example to me because he really kind of, we've been talking about strips that hew so close to McKay, like J.G. Jones, then ones that take it in whole new directions. James really split the difference between channeling McKay and doing his own thing. He got the look, as you can see, of Little Nemo really just right. He gives the Flatiron building the same kind of glory that the Palaces of Slumberland have. That exploding sun on the right-hand side of the page there, that's a pure McKay image that could come straight out of a Little Nemo strip. He also, James, studied the New York Herald pages very carefully to reverse engineer a coloring technique that would really capture that feeling of lithographic newsprinting. But on the other hand, this incredibly experimental layout, if you can see where that clown is on the lower left-hand side, that's where the strip begins. It reads to the right and then up and around the top of the Flatiron building and down into the subway in this sort of tortured circle. Though it's very much in the spirit of these incredibly adventurous designs that McKay would have, that's the type of thing that McKay never would have done or tried. For all of McKay's inventiveness, there were certain rules that he always adhered to. Every strip he ever did read from left to right and top to bottom. They generally, the camera angle really doesn't change. The characters are always presented in the same perspective, almost like they're on like a proscenium stage. So James, to me, in doing something that's so close to McKay in some ways, but violates so many of his rules, he's somebody who's not he's not just channeling McKay, but he's sort of taking the handoff from him and trying to keep the ball moving downfield, which is what I think a lot of the cartoonists in this book are doing. It's about McKay was someone who was constantly pushing this medium forward. He was so aware that he was at the dawn between animation and cartooning. He knew that he was right at the beginning of art forms that really mattered, and not many people thought that way back then, but McKay thought that way from the very beginning of his career. And it was a real honor to be able to work on this book with all these people who I think are his inheritors in that sense of taking this stuff as seriously as it deserves to be taken. So now my partner, Andrew Karl, editor-in-chief of Locust Moon, will tell you a little bit more about the strips that took McKay's influence in whole new directions.
Hi. So yeah, James Harvey's strip is really interesting to me for the reasons Josh laid out, in that it does sort of split the difference between this sort of slavish visual recreation of McKay's aesthetic while also doing things he never would have thought of doing. And some of the strips that I want to talk about today are ones that did go even farther afield on every level, whether it's visually or by taking a sort of more metafictional or referential approach to them, or just to Nemo, to Slumberland, to McKay himself. So I guess I'd start with one that's one of the most extreme departures, which was Mike and Laura Allred's, where, as you can see, there are no Slumberland characters. There are barely any panels. Instead of reading top to bottom, or even in a sort of circle like James did, this one reads as sort of a inward spiral, which doesn't even end with a wake-up panel. It ends with a sort of just moment of clarity right in the middle. So it broke pretty much every rule that McKay had, or that we would expect of the book, but it actually works beautifully anyways. And it's sort of became this sort of meditation on the relationship between dreams and death that's really beautiful. And the essence of McKay is so captured, both in the experimentation in it and the sort of unreliable but still very perfectly formed lines that construct the space. So in another sense, we also have Raul Gonzalez's strip, which is again a huge visual departure from McKay. And Rose is a fine artist who decided to tell a sort of border-crossing fable, which is very deeply personal to him. His parents were migrant workers that traveled back and forth between America and Mexico when he was a child. And I think he was able to fuse that very personal set of experiences and personal sort of dreamlike approach to these ideas with the way McKay approached his own fantasies. And that is why this one feels so clearly in the spirit of a McKay strip, with the way he approaches the page and escalates the sort of insanity and renders it beautifully, and does have sort of stand-ins for the characters that we're familiar with. But it feels just like a personal to him as Nemo felt to McKay, and we really loved it for that. Then there's, I don't know how well it shows up on the screen, but Maëlle Delvaux took a really different direction, where she created a whole strip out of cut paper. And this strip was excellently done visually, but it was also very interesting because not only did it break the fourth wall, which McKay did a lot in his work, but it also even sort of breaks the two-dimensionality of the page itself, where by the end of the strip, the panels are crumpling up and falling off the page, the panel numbers are slipping away, and everything is sort of chaos. And just from the material standpoint, it's something you would never expect to see happening in McKay's world, but again, it's capturing exactly the sort of wild inventiveness that we expect. So I also want to talk about this strip by Dean Haspiel, which I guess compared to the last few ones we looked at, looks more normal, I guess. There's no burnt paper or, crumpled up stuff. But Dean's strip is actually really, really interesting and did something very unique in that he wasn't content to just pay tribute to McKay. He also wanted to bring in some of his other biggest influences as a comics creator, and reference some of the other sort of titans in the history of the medium. And he does it through this story of basically setting up Little Nemo as asking if he ever really woke up over the course of his life, if he ever got out of bed. Because we never, even when he woke up in the comics, it was only ever in that one little room in that little bed. So what if that really was his whole existence? And here we're seeing, with the help of some of McKay's sort of fellow master comic artists, a sort of journey where he leaves that room for the first time and discovers, some of the things he's been missing in the outside world. So of course you have George Harriman's Crazy Cat and Ignatz bonking him out of sleep and inspiring him to get out of bed. And by the time he walks out, he ends up in sort of Will Eisner's, where he lived in kind of gritty New York streets. And he looks up in the sky, and there's Jack Kirby's, Technicolor superheroes exploding into each other above him. And when he finally, at least appears to find some kind of reason for all this, of course, that's the moment that he wakes up again, safely back in the world of McKay as a child, because after all, this is still a Little Nemo strip. Now, Bob Sikoryak is another artist who decided to blend influences with McKay. But unlike Dean Haspiel, he reached far outside of comics. And he decided to sort of create a fusion between two characters or artists, in the sense, who were really obsessed with the ideas of dreams. And if you're curious and can't tell who influenced what in this piece, it was just all Freud. So something that I think makes this one really effective is that Bob was able to really, it looks different, but in a similar sense, like someone like James Harvey or J.G. Jones, replicate a lot of the visual language and tics of McKay in terms of the character staging, the very, the way the panels are laid out, the lettering even, with all its little quirks and wobbles that everyone is always questions just how intentional it was on McKay's part. But he uses all of this like very clear McKay imagery to tell a story or just almost give a lecture from the perspective of Freud. That's really all in his words. So it becomes this sort of alternate universe fusion of almost what if Freud were the brilliant cartoonist and not McKay. But you see it also has a little cameo from Gertie in the corner there, which is an extra nice little touch. And then there were a few strips in the book that more directly dealt with Winsor McCay specifically as a person. Like, for example, Phil Barlow's piece here is this really energetic but also kind of depressing biography of McKay's life from life to death, from his various inventions and artistic pursuits up until he ended up pretty depressingly shackled by his obligations to William Randolph Hearst and the New York Herald, where he was stuck for a lot of the later years of his life and not able to really pursue, especially cartoons as an art form. And of course, an extra little fun thing about this strip is that in the final panel where he both dies and of course falls out of bed, it does include a sort of dig on the comic and this whole project itself, where after he dies, his wife says to him, "Oh, what a pity. But now that most of Windsor's work is public domain, he can be imitated by lesser artists with a fraction of his skill and vision." So, yeah, that's where we come in. And then, Cliff Chang is another artist who really got right up to McKay's door, physically. These are McKay's characters basically visiting him in that Sheepshead Bay home. And whispering in his ear and inspiring him to draw one last page, basically create one more dream, which is really sweet, I think. But the most powerful part of this strip to me is the way he treated the imp character, where in the first panel, he's holding the mask of what McKay had him look like, which is this pretty cartoonish, gross caricature, and he's looking at it saying how silly, which I read as sort of a child's vernacular of, bullshit. And if you follow the rest of the strip as the imp's journey, which I think is easy to do, especially because, for this character in particular, who has such a strange, unfortunate existence, this to me is one of the places where he feels like he has the energy of a real child, like a real being throughout the strip, like when he's walking on the banister. And at the end, he does get a chance to whisper in his own creator's ear as this sort of real boy who was trapped under the mask of sort of gross racist caricature, and tell him something that perhaps he needed to hear. And maybe as long as Winsor lived, he never really did get a chance to hear that or internalize it. So I think with Cliff's strip, he gave a sort of hopeful idea of, maybe we would have hoped that this kind of thing had happened, that at some point that would have been an enlightening moment to him, that his characters could reach out and say, you know what, this could be better. So the next two things I want to talk about are strips that directly dealt with the very, the most common trope of Nemo, which is the Wakeup Panel, in which a lot, we've talked about before, every page would end with one of these. And a lot of times he would be falling out of bed. And they were very useful, I think, for McKay and for the artists who worked on the book, because they allowed for a sort of safety net or a reset button, because no matter what happened on the page, no matter what formal experiments are going on, or what crazy danger Nemo ends up being in, we know at the end he'll get out of it, he'll be safe, he'll be in bed, and that'll be the end of that. So a few artists in our book decided to engage that pretty directly, with Galen Schulman basically extrapolating, well, if there's a boy who's really violently falling out of bed from nightmares every single night, what's the end game here? It might not look too great. So going even further down that rabbit hole is Jim Rugg, who did this beautiful, very conceptual minimal piece, who sort of asked another question, which is, what if it didn't work? Like, what if that last panel wasn't there to catch him? What if there's a hole in the net? And what if he just kept falling forever in a dream? Like, as you see, that's the edge of the page there. He's not even confined to a newspaper page anymore. He's just in the ether. And that's sort of, you would think, would be the single most frightening thing for a character who lives in this fictional world. It's like, even that last escape is, he's in the wind now. So the last strip I wanted to talk about is actually one that also addressed the confines of the newspaper page, because it really just blew through it. So Paul Rivage is one of the few artists in the book that decided to take up more than one page, which was really the one most ironclad rule that McKay always had to follow. I mean, it's a big page. Josh, if you hold up our book, like that's a big comic. You could fit a lot on a page, and that's how big the newspapers were. But maybe it's not enough for all of us. And the way that I love the way here that Paul sort of acknowledged the idea that a Nemo strip is supposed to end in the bottom right corner of a single page by literally just blowing up the page with these balloons and bring us, no, let's go back to the top and have some more fun before we get to the bottom. And that idea of breaking just the ultimate rule is to me one of the reasons that made this such a perfect tribute, because that's what McKay was all about, was breaking these rules. But even he had some. So right about the end, I also want to talk about this last strip from McKay, which is actually the final page in our book. And when we selected it, we didn't want to go for one of the crazy visual masterpieces to show off, look, hey, McKay really was a good artist. Don't you believe us? We decided to focus on one that was more about his humor and could offer a nice perspective on the book that you would have just read. So in this strip, the Slumberland characters, as it goes on, are getting increasingly more poorly drawn. And by the end, they've been turned into these really crude stick figures, which, if you look at them, they're actually kind of awesome stick figures, because McKay probably was not capable of drawing really bad art. But the characters, meanwhile, are complaining about, what's going on? Like, this isn't the way I'm supposed to be drawn. Like, make me look like I'm supposed to look. I want to go back to normal. And, of course, at the, in the Wakeup panel, there he is, back drawn in McKay's style, safe and sound. And to me, this felt like such a great way to end the book, where McKay was brought into all of these weird situations that neither he nor McKay had any say in, and really experimented on all these new ways. But ultimately, we felt it was important to make sure that he ended the journey back in McKay's hands, and no worse for wear. So I do think, though, if McKay woke up today and saw where comics have come, I think he would be pretty astounded by the evolutions that have gone underway, and the amount of people who are really using very singular and experimental voices to bring comics forward. And we think a lot of people are in this book, but far beyond that. And I want to bring up a little anecdote that Josh told me about, actually, where Winsor was invited to a dinner in the 1920s of a bunch of animators who'd gathered and wanted to hear him talk, since he's one of the fathers of what they're all doing. And McKay was by all accounts very playful, nice, delightful guy. He was not a jerk, but he did stand up in front of all these gathered animators, and he more or less told them that I created this medium a decade ago, and none of you have moved it forward. You've just commercialized it, and you cheapened it, and you're exploiting it when you should be exploring it. And I think in contrast to that, if if we held a similar dinner today with, inviting a lot of the people in this book and a lot of the people who are going to be, at SPX over the next few days, I think he would feel like he fit in a lot more, and hopefully he wouldn't yell at anyone. Yeah, and that's all we got.
We have about 5 minutes or so left for questions, so feel free.
Well, question one, did Winsor McCay actually draw it 16 by 21?
Slightly larger.
Yep.
Slightly larger.
Yep. He'd have to use multiple pieces of paper because there just wasn't, you couldn't reach.
And he didn't always draw it the same size either, but
There
I
was a
think it
little
was
fluctuation.
always larger than 16 by 21.
Yeah.
But
We just came from the archives and saw an original. It was like that.
Yeah.
oh, that's amazing.
They have an original in the archives.
Which strip was it?
Gosh, it's picture of that
Is there one place where most of his materials have been deposited?
I think they're pretty much broken up through various collections.
What's the museum that we
Oh, yeah, it was like one.
Oh, with Billy Ireland?
Yeah.
Well, they have a ton of his.
The Billy Ireland Museum in
They have a lot of the
Where is
newspaper
that?
strips in
Ohio
Ohio
State
State
in Ohio State University. Yeah, they have a really big McKay collection.
My hand. That's the size of.
It's like if you like the blue book, it's a spring.
Right.
Yeah.
What's the medium he's using to color? What's the?
Well, he wasn't coloring them. I mean, he would work very closely with the New York Herald staff, who had, at the time, it was like the best coloring that a newspaper had ever seen. And so he would direct them very specifically on how he wanted the colors to look, and then it would be done by the newspaper staff.
And is that what your artist did as well?
No, our artists mostly colored their own work, and I mean, people worked in so many different media and different. Some people did watercolors, other people it's all digital colors, and everything in between, from cut paper to whatever.
And like James Harvey, who Josh talked about, for example, he basically digitally recreated the Ben-Day dot process that would have gone in printing presses then.
Yeah.
And that's how he was able to recreate those colors so well.
A bunch of artists took different approaches to trying to recreate that look of like the colored dots, and it's interesting to see how they each figured out their own style of it.
Yeah.
What was McKay's reaction to Walt Disney's work in the 20s?
Okay, what was McKay's reaction to Walt Disney's work? He was a fan. I think he was the first person he saw actually, like I was saying, doing something with animation, it seemed. And I actually just recently visited, there's a Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco, and in it there's an original cell from The Sinking of the Lusitania, which is one of McKay's other animated shorts that he had given to Walt Disney and signed it to him and said, like, I can't remember the exact message on it, but it was basically, thanks for keeping it up, basically. Yeah.
How was the process like in creating the stories? Would they initially just give you a script and you guys had to approve it or approve layouts and they went, or they just said surprise me and you got a final digital production? And
I think it was a different process for different artists.
It was, but generally it was a pretty loose editorial process. We worked with the cartoonists whose work we respected, and we kind of said, okay, it's got to be a dream. It doesn't even have to be Nemo, but it needs to be a dream, and it needs to end with the dreamer waking up, and kind of go from there. There wasn't really any script process or anything like that. Outside of, there's a couple of examples of strips in here where there's a different artist and writer, and sometimes somebody would submit a script to us, and we would do some small editorial
Those are
stuff.
definitely in the minority.
Those are kind of just a handful of strips. Mostly this was just people following their vision, and then we published their work.
Yeah. Tried to keep the content not, not R-rated or anything.
Yeah,
like that,
yeah.
basically.
Keep it relatively. I mean, there's some pretty disturbing stuff in this book. To
Yeah,
be fair,
but more like
we
emotionally
did tell
disturbing.
people no nudity. Try to keep it
Yeah.
a little bit family friendly.
Yeah.
So I went to my local library after I saw this talk announced, and I was not aware of this, but there was an exhibit at the Newark Museum and the Jewish Museum maybe 10 years ago or so.
Okay.
Where I discovered all of these reproductions that
Oh,
really
yeah?
got me started. And so I went to the library and I immediately said, buy this. And they said, oh, it's not one of our approved vendors or whatever. But they had a smaller format. Yeah, it's like, idiots, you know, the libraries should be, you know, why are you sticking with?
Give them our phone number.
So I don't know what the problem is with libraries. This is in Arlington, Virginia. They're pretty progressive and large. So just, I don't know what the practicalities of the publishing business are.
How do we
and
become an
how
approved
you
vendor?
get
Yeah.
tracking through that. I just wanted to let you know that there's this block.
Yeah.
'Cause they had a small, I guess you extracted.
Yeah,
and they
we-
had this in their teen section.
Yeah, we recently partnered with the company Toon Books, it's run by Francoise Mouly, and they did a sort of abridged, smaller selection of the pages that has some extra educational material stuff in there, but it's maybe a quarter, if that,
Yeah.
of the content here, and the size is it's about this big. Yeah, there's one of
Yeah,
those
it's the
over
one on
there.
the table over
And so
there.
I don't know,
Yeah.
how that vendor made it through
Yeah.
the libraries, whatever, and you didn't. But
Well,
at least they had a gateway drug.
You're looking at our publishing company.
Yeah.
Literally.
Literally.
Yeah.
I want you guys to
You want to come on board?
But yeah, thanks.
No,
No, thank you for the heads up. We got to
Yeah.
figure that out.
Oh.
Yeah.
Did all of the artists, or was it only some? Did they explain to you what they were doing, or did you find the examples for most of those, or did they discuss that? And then also, did you have an idea of how big the book was going to be from the beginning, or did you have to reject some, or did some people say no? So is it bigger or smaller, or?
Okay, I can tackle a lot of this, I think. So most of these comparisons that we have were generated by us. I think Dean Haspel's strip where he took in the other artist influences, he did explain that to us, like before he even started drawing it. And that leads to sort of one of your other questions, which is that when we originally pictured the book, it was going to be maybe 100 pages, I think, max. This one ended up being 144 because we kept realizing, oh, we forgot another one of our favorite artists. And then artists that we'd invited said, hey, my friend's really cool. Do you think he could give a shot? And he did. And there are people who you saw today, actually, who were complete strangers to us, who had heard about it and sent us a Facebook message. And we're like, okay, I guess we'll see your stuff. And then it ended up being beautiful, and it's in the book. So it was really pretty much out of our control. It was just down to what would fill out a book of just good stuff. And there were pieces that were rejected from the book. And actually, Dean Haspel's first attempt at a strip we rejected because it was beautiful. It was very well designed. But it didn't feel like it had the DNA of McKay in it so much. So while we loved it, we just couldn't figure out how to fit in the book. And we had to break it to him like, look, we love you as a creator. This isn't really going to work then. So he tried to rework it a little bit, and we rejected it again. And then, because he's just a patient angel and I guess really cares about the project.
Looking around to see if he's here.
He decided to start from scratch and come up with what you saw. So there are other people who didn't, for understandable reason, who didn't, just keep doing something until it made it into the book. But there are other ones who usually if pieces didn't make it in, it was because they just didn't seem to combine the personal engagement and engagement with McKay quite as much. Whether they used their personal characters but didn't really point them in the direction of McKay, or just did something that felt a little more like kind of dry fan fiction, sort of, which was not what we wanted. If it didn't have something that was purely special and personal to that person, then it was, it just wouldn't be the same. So, yeah.
You could probably make a cool book with the strips we rejected, but they just didn't quite fit into the overall mix that we were trying to put together.
The quality was almost universally good. It was just about the...
Rejection collection.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a long day
I think we can take one more question.
Go ahead. Bruce has been here since the beginning. Give Bruce a chance.
Nemo, when McKay did these projects, these are all Sunday strips.
Yeah.
Was this his full-time job, or did he also have to do daily things?
He did edit. Well, go ahead.
Well, he did these every week. He also had different strips that he would do at different times. He was also largely an editorial cartoonist, which was a huge part of what he would do. He would get assignments from the Herald to do certain illustrations and political cartoons. And in like the 19-teens, that gradually became more and more of what his workload as an artist was. And though like the art is really stunningly beautiful, some of his stuff in those political cartoons is mind-blowingly gorgeous. It's not stuff that he really liked doing. It was a little bit of a graveyard for his creativity. He felt trapped having to do these things day in, day out, when he really wanted to be working on animation and Little Nemo. Those were the two things he cared about most.
Have they been reprinted?
Yeah, there have been. I don't know if there are any in print right now, but there definitely have been collections of the McKay editorial stuff. And some of them, there's like it's strange to look at some of them because some of them have the most ridiculous ideas, but then the art is like the most beautiful stuff you've ever seen. But they have these kind of tortured, pretentious, pompous ideas about society. And there's an editor named Arthur Brisbane who was the author of a lot of them, and you can tell he thought very highly of his own opinions. And he had this weapon of McKay to like put his opinions out there into the world. And I don't think McKay liked being that kind of weapon.
Yeah.
All right.
Can
They
we do
want
just
to
one
get
more?
through?
We can't just do one more?
Why don't we do one
Take
more?
this.
What was your question?
I'm just kind of curious, especially because you're also passionate about Little Nemo, how you felt both the animated adaptation and the current run through, I would say IDW, how you felt sort of stacked up.
The animation, weirdly enough, I've never seen all the way through. Because by the time we started working on the book, I was like, I wanted my filter of McKay to be going straight from McKay. So it's something on my okay, I'll get to it when I'm a little bit less, into it. Because I feel like the more personally I'm invested in McKay's work, the more I might be annoyed by, the 80s tortured adaptation of it. The story behind the movie is really interesting. But and then the IDW book I thought was really fun. IDW did a little miniseries, 4-issue miniseries, I think, that's sort of, a modern kid, jumping in and taking Nemo's place in Slumberland. And it's really cute. By one artist, normal size. So
Yeah, beautiful artwork by Gabriel Rodriguez. Just a very charming book.
Yeah.
All right.
Okay.
Thank you
Sorry
so
about
much for
that.
having us here. This has been such a pleasure.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.